Good afternoon, and welcome to the February webinar presentation from the Bureau of Business Research, where we'll discuss the topic of labor supply in the U.S. and Nebraska economy. This is the second webinar in our spring webinar series. My name is Eric Thompson. I'll be presenting the PowerPoint and webinar today. I am a faculty member in the Department of Economics and also director of the Bureau of Business Research. A few things to point out before we get started. First of all, you have an opportunity to participate in a chat window during the webinar. So feel free to chat with some of the other participants in the webinar as we're going through the PowerPoint slides. We also have a question and answer window that you can open. We will be answering participant questions at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, but you can type your questions at any time as they occur to you, or you can type them at the end of the presentation, but that's when we'll be answering your questions. So with those 2 points made, I'm going to go ahead and proceed with our webinar on labor supply. We're going to look at two overarching issues. First of all, the current challenges with labor supply here in Nebraska and around the U.S. And as well, we're going to look at long-term challenges with labor supply and an issue with skills gaps here in Nebraska. So in Nebraska and around the nation, challenges with finding workers, which are ongoing, have become especially severe in the last 2 years and appear to be likely to be challenging in the coming months. So we're going to talk about that specific issue right now, but also talk about our long-term challenges in the second half of the webinar. Okay, starting first talking about the current challenges. So there is a shortage, some would say, or certainly a challenge in finding workers right now. Demand, with the economy growing at a rapid pace, demand is quite strong for workers right now, and supply is down. So that combination of a great need for workers, but a smaller supply of workers has created and exacerbated the supply-demand mismatch here in Nebraska. Let me give you some specific statistics about that. And of course, not just here in Nebraska, but around the country and even in many countries overseas. But let's focus on Nebraska. So the labor supply has been shrinking. In particular, Nebraska's labor force participation rate declined by about nearly 2% between December 2019 and December 2021. So in other words, if 65% or 70% of persons age 16 plus in Nebraska had been working in December 2019, say 70%, by December 2021, it would have fallen 2% down to just above 68%. So that's a significant drop in the number of people participating in our state's labor force. In a state our size, that corresponds to about 20,000 people statewide that dropped out of the labor force, and it still dropped out as of December 2021. And what happened more particularly is rates dropped significantly just after the beginning of the pandemic and throughout 2020 and even early in 2021. We saw a drop in the labor force participation rate, and then we just haven't seen much evidence that the rate is snapping back yet, coming back yet. So it's kind of stayed flat throughout most of 2021. There's a little evidence nationally that labor force participation rate improved last month. And in general, that's what we're looking to see, that participation rates may improve here in 2022. But so far, there was a big drop and the recovery has not started. So this has got us down about 20,000 workers in our state, again, during a period where workers are in great demand, creating this labor supply and demand mismatch. Now, who is dropping out? Unfortunately, at least I'm not aware of a U.S. Of data produced by the U.S. Department of Labor that will show us current data on who has dropped out of the Nebraska labor force. But there is some really detailed national data month to month or year to year that's available on who is leaving the labor force. So this is a little bit of a different comparison. We're not just looking at December 2019 and December 2021. We're looking at the entire calendar year for 2019 and 2021 to see what patterns exist and who's dropped out. So one of the interesting things you'll see if you look at that data is there's no gender gap. At points during the pandemic, there was some evidence and certainly great concern that women may be dropping out of the labor force at a faster pace than men. But if you compare all of 2021 with all of 2019, actually men have dropped out of the labor force slightly more quickly or slightly more than women. Both are around 1.5% for the whole calendar year, slightly bigger drop for men than for women. So no gender gap is evident. However, there are some notable gaps or changes in participation rates differences by age. So those are summarized here. If you think about the oldest age group where a significant share of people still participate in the labor force, that's no longer 55 to 65, actually got a significant chunk of 65 to 74-year-olds that continue to participate in the labor market. The age of retirement, maybe not according to Social Security, but according to what people are choosing to do, the age of retirement has been rising up into the late 60s and 70s. Okay, so among this group, however, from calendar year 2019 to 2021, we saw the biggest drop in participation, fell about 2%. Why might that happen? Well, obviously, older workers would be most susceptible from serious complications or health problems related to COVID. Also, retirees have a lot of equity in their homes. They often have a lot of savings, are involved in the stock market, and the value of homes and the stock market has been booming in recent years. So all these factors may have combined to see a sharper labor force dropout rate among these older workers. By way of comparison, if you look at sort of the prime working age cohorts from 25 to 64, those fell too, but only about 1% or less in most cases. And among teenagers, age 16 to 19, the labor force participation rate actually rose during this period. Any concerns about COVID, which would be lessened for this younger age group, might have been overpowered by the higher wages that teenage workers would see. Remember, in a lot of cases, the teenagers keep the wages and the parents pay for the cost of living. So even with inflation impacting real wages, higher wages might seem like a real positive for teenagers. Okay, so what's the implication of this age difference? Well, with so many retirements, you're going to see with retirements that a lot of that is permanent, or it's often permanent. It's hard to lure people back once they've crossed that bridge and decided to retire. So it may not be feasible to get our 2% of workers back here in Nebraska. Not all of them anyway, because a lot of the dropout has been related to retirements. We're anticipating that about half of the lost workers will come back in 2022. So we'll have about 10,000 new workers for our labor force on top of sort of your normal growth in workforce as people join, graduate high school, graduate college, or finish their schooling and join the workforce or migrate to the state. Now, one other factor that's led to a slower to the drop in the labor force in 2020 and 2021 was that we had a big drop in international migration as well as less labor force participation. In fact, last 2 years, international migration has dropped by about 30%, but in 2022, we can see that bounce back to more of a normal rate. So with that, with normal graduations or people joining the labor force, and with 10,000 of our workers coming back, we should have pretty strong labor force growth this year and in early 2023 to help maybe ease this labor supply challenge that we see right now in our state. So balance should return to the labor market over 2022 and early 2023. And the market will seem more balanced. Now, when I say balanced labor market, it's nice to be the employer, right? It's more challenging to be a worker often. So even right now, it's tough to be a worker, advantageous to be an employer doing the hiring, but it's a little better for workers right now, perhaps a lot better. And we think we'll return to more of a balance or more of a normal situation that people would have been experiencing over the last 10 to 15 years in 2022 and early 2023. So that's what I mean by balanced. Challenges, however, could persist. The challenges we're seeing now in industries with modest wages. So some of the hard hit sectors like restaurants may continue to see challenges with labor supply going forward. Okay, so this current situation coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and ensuing recession, we're still going to face long-term skills gap challenges, even when the labor market goes back to more of a normal balance as we're expecting over the next year to year and a half. So let's talk a little bit about this long-term challenge with a skills gap that Nebraska has faced. And I think it's important to be precise here. So what is evidence of a skills gap? Well, if you survey, and we've done this, we've been at the Bureau, we've been involved with a lot of surveys of business and households with the Nebraska Department of Labor, Nebraska Department of Economic Development. And when you take those surveys, you'll hear a lot of businesses, not just now, but over the last decade, reporting that it's difficult for them to hire the key workers they need to hire. Likewise, you'll hear from many individuals that it's hard to find a new job that'll use their skills. So those things are true, but does that really provide evidence of a skills gap across the board in the various occupations we have? Well, maybe people are reporting it's difficult, but also maybe not. And the reason is it's supposed to be difficult. So if you're running a business, your greatest challenge might be engagement with your customers and making sure you've got the revenue that you need. But the second biggest challenge might be making sure you build a really efficient and skilled workforce for your business. So it's one of the great challenges business people face. So it's not surprising they would say it was difficult. From the worker's perspective, managing your career, finding jobs that'll utilize your skills is one of the great challenges of your career. And it's in a sense, it's supposed to be difficult. So people reporting that it's difficult is interesting, but by itself may not be evidence of a skills gap. So I would argue that a better definition might be a skills gap occurs when there is a consistent lack of workers for an occupation, a specific occupation. So you do hear evidence of difficulty, but there's a clearly identified source that's leading to that, again, persistent shortage of workers. So what could these sources be that could lead to a persistent challenge in certain occupations? Well, one issue that's talked about a lot is structural change. So new technologies, international trade, new products that are being developed, all these things can lead to a change in the skills, the types of skills that employers are looking for. And a mismatch could develop between the skills employers seek, the new emerging skills they seek, and the skills that the workforce has. That's known as structural change. And it, in a dynamic capitalist economy, that sort of structural change does happen and can create shortages in newly emerging skills, and likewise workers who are skilled, but they don't have the skills employers are looking for to the same degree anymore. And over time, with education, retraining, other things, those structural changes will work out, but it is a long process. Now, obviously, education and training programs are one way to adapt to structural change or generally get people prepared for hard to fill occupations. But education and training programs, the education sector isn't always as responsive as it might be. A lot of times education's in the public sector, maybe not quite as responsive as private industry would be to the needs of employers. It's certainly something we work on very hard to be responsive, but that can be a source of the skills gap as well if education institutions aren't responsive enough. What can be another source for the skills gap? Well, sometimes the appeal of occupations goes away. The demand is still there, but an occupation that many people were willing to do in the past, they're not willing to do in the future, even with somewhat higher wages. So long haul trucking is an excellent example of that. In older generations, while it was always a difficult, challenging job, being away from your family, grueling work, that industry was able to attract a significant share of workers. But those difficult attributes of the occupation seem to be weighing even harder on the current generation of workers and making the appeal of the occupation fall significantly. And there's sort of ongoing gaps, persistent gaps in the number of people willing to go into long haul trucking. It's something we've been trying to work around, but there's a skills gap there. What other factors can be at work? Well, taxes on middle-class workers can be a big challenge. For new and emerging occupations or high-demand occupations that require specific skills, you would need people to take the initiative to train for those occupations, to go to school or work on their own or volunteer at work for a new assignment, even though that makes work more challenging in order to upgrade their skills. And people will do that for a lot of reasons, because of the satisfaction of being productive and meeting a need, but they also partly do it for money, for monetary remuneration. And I'll put in the extra effort. I'll go to school at night. I'll put the extra effort at work so that I can make more. Well, if the government is taxing away 50% of the additional money you'll make through income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, they all really add up. That creates a disincentive for workers to take steps on their own to eliminate skills gaps and allows the skills gaps to persist. There's also an issue with the social safety net. Sometimes that discourages people from taking the initiative to learn new skills. There's a lot of support provided for education costs, healthcare costs, retirement income by the government. And some people may find that with those benefits out there, the incentive just isn't as strong as it might be to find ways to raise your wages and working income. So that can become one of the contributors to an ongoing skills gap. A last factor is what I call career destruction. This is when people have the needed skills, but employers are reluctant to hire them because of some problems or challenges in their work history. So a lot of employers report that it's difficult to hire in skilled occupations, especially skilled blue-collar occupations, because workers have a poor work history or are challenged in passing background checks required for jobs. And so the skills are there, but they can't be used in the economy because of these issues. Now, over time, people who maybe have these issues in terms of their work history or ability to pass a background check, they can address those issues and get their skills back to where they can be used in the market. But this is a big challenge for society, and again, I think can be a persistent source of our skills gap. The last thing, of course, we talk about a lot in Nebraska is net out migration, the brain drain issue. That certainly contributes to our skills gap. So we could have a whole calendar year of webinars talking about all these issues. I'd like to talk a little more in depth about one of them, that's structural change. What are our emerging occupations, high skill occupations that are where there's a lot of job openings in our economy, and can our education training programs, can we have confidence that they'll prepare the workers that are needed? So I'd like to focus on just those first issue or first and second issue from this list. So let me give you, let's go through some occupations that are thought to have a lot of annual openings. Openings created by net job growth, so we're just going to have more workers in those occupations, or due to a need to replace workers because of retirement and so forth. And you can see on an annual basis in Nebraska, there'd be nearly 900 openings for tractor, trailer, and truck drivers. And I'm distinguishing between sort of permanent ongoing openings and openings that are regularly filled during a year. So more of a market measure of openings rather than just postings. For better or worse, that's the type of definition we use. So about 900 tractor, trailer, truck drivers. What you can see there is that about half of those job openings each year is due to a net growth in the number of tractor, trailer, truck drivers, an increasing need in our economy for these types of workers. But there's a lot of openings every year just due to people retiring, leaving the occupation. Somewhat similar situation for registered nurses. In that case, about 3 out of 8 of the job openings are due to net growth in the number of registered nurses that our healthcare sector needs, and about 5 out of 8 due to a need to replace people as they retire or leave the occupation. Contrast that with farmers and ranchers. We're anticipating over 700 openings on an annual basis, but almost all of that is to replace retiring farmers and ranchers rather than new growth. So the occupations vary a lot based on how many of the openings are due to growth and how many are due to replacement of existing workers. General repair, maintenance and repair, a little bit more focused on replacement. Sales reps, it's more about replacement than it is new openings. Teachers, more about replacements than it is new openings. Carpenters, well, the construction industry is growing very quickly. It's actually more about net new openings, job growth, than it is about replacing workers. And we can go into the second, the 11 through 20 on our top 20 list and comment some more. Industrial machinery mechanics, that's more about net growth in that type of skilled blue collar worker than it is about replacement. Machinists, fair amount of balance between growth and replacement. Welders is more about replacement. Electricians and construction, more about growth. And obviously with your computer related occupations, it's more about net job growth than it is about replacement. And then railroad workers looks a little bit more like farmers and ranchers. So looking at this data, you can kind of break down these high demand occupations. These are occupations where there's a lot of openings and they're higher skill, either blue collar or white collar occupations. The first group would be what I would call traditional occupations. These have always been large occupations. There's a lot of openings just to replace retiring workers or workers who are somehow otherwise leaving the occupation. And you can break these into two groups. Things that are somewhat unique to Nebraska. We have so many farmers and railroad workers in this state compared to most places. Or you would see similar openings numbers in other states. So teachers, managers, sales representatives, auto technicians, welders. You can look at almost any state, there'd be a lot of openings in these jobs, primarily due to replacing existing workers. Well, if it's an historically large occupation, our society probably has a good existing system for bringing people into these occupations, whether it's obviously there's a lot of mentors out there. People are more likely to know people who work in those occupations. And usually there's been a lot of education programs established either at companies or in high schools, colleges, community colleges to prepare people. The second group would be what I would call occupations in growing industries. Now, a lot of times these industries have been growing for quite some time, like healthcare, and in recent decades, construction, transportation, logistics, truck drivers. So our society for a long time has been aware about these opportunities in growing industries and has been developing programs to meet those needs. There's a lot of maybe there should be more, but there's a lot of truck driver programs out there. There probably should be more, but there are programs, apprenticeship programs for carpenters and electricians. We've done some analysis of nursing and found that Nebraska actually does produce enough bachelor level nurses each year to meet the openings in our state in that occupation. So our shortages are more about net out migration than they are about anything else. So pretty good systems exist in this case. I think where we have the greatest need or greatest trouble in meeting the skills gap or producing the skills workers is what I would refer to as emerging occupations, occupations that reflect a new mode of production. So computer science is an example of this. Software developers, computer systems analysts, they're helping industries of all kinds, not just growing industries, but industries of all kinds, produce their goods and services, but with a different approach. So people might be relying on software, substituting software for work that people used to do by hand in an office. Think about like a bookkeeping software or something of that nature. So the mode of production of services is changing. Same for same for manufacturing. A lot more of production is occurring through robotics and robots in factories. Well, an emerging occupation, it was always there, but increasingly important occupation is industrial machinery mechanics who install and maintain those robots. And so it, again, represents something of a new mode of production. These seem to be the areas where we have the fewest institutions to meet this rapidly emerging need. There may be fewer mentors. Young people are less likely, or people are less likely to know someone in that occupation. And while schools and universities are working hard to develop more training opportunities, they may have more work to do still. So computer science is an excellent example of this. It's really challenging to get a computer science degree. The courses are very difficult. The courses are there, the opportunities are there, but are we doing enough to mentor and help people make it through a computer science program? There's going to be some brilliant kids that can kind of do it on their own, but what about those really smart kids that just need a little help to make it through the program, or more than a little help? Could we do more? And could that help us meet our skills gap? Similar with industrial machinery mechanics, which is a much more challenging type of blue collar work. So I would argue that in terms of skills mismatch, training, and education, we probably need to focus our efforts on those new and emerging occupations where our whole training and education system, our society is sort of less prepared to close the skills gap on its own. That might be the most effective thing we can do. That's the perspective I wanted to provide for you today. Others may have a different approach, and certainly we need to think carefully about how to address each of these sources of the skills gap, and there's policies that we could discuss in a different webinar in the future. So those are the points I wanted to make today. I see I have one question. I'll see what other questions might come up. Give you a minute to type in what you'd like to ask. I guess while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and answer the first question, which asks, what about the larger boomer generation leaving and a smaller generation coming in to replace it? Yes, we do think that there'll be I think we saw this perhaps in the last decade, but certainly in the next decade, we're going to see some decline in the labor force participation rate because of our large baby boomer generation. So more and more of those workers are going to be above 65 or above 75 in the baby boom generation. And so that's naturally going to lead to a spike in retirements relative as a share of the workforce compared to what we'd have seen 15 or 20 years ago. So there is a long-term trend towards more retirements and a decline in the labor force for that reason, or at least the labor force participation rate. I think part of what we've seen the last few years is we had 5 or 6 years of retirements all in a year because of the incentives and conditions people were facing with COVID and the recession. So a lot of that might have gotten moved up due to safety, and again, due to the large increases in the value of people's homes and their stock accounts if they have them. So I think we accelerated that long-term trend that the questioner is asking about. Now, I think the good news is the retire our large baby boom cohort, it won't stop the growth in the labor force, but it may slow it. In other words, if labor force participation is declining in more of a slow, steady way due to these retirements, but our population is continuing to grow, and it has been in Nebraska. We've been growing at the national average most of the time over the last decade, at or near it. And so the labor force can continue to grow, but maybe more slowly. And I think that'll be a challenge for business in the coming decade, how to economize on labor even more. So we can have a nice match between the demand and supply. The other thing about long-term trends is you have more time to address them. So certainly increasing legal immigration above our traditional levels. We want to get back that 30% that we're down the last few years. But even after we do that, maybe we need to expand international migration of especially younger workers. Of course, I'm focused on legal immigration. That may be a way to address this challenge that the questioner asked about. Oh, I see a second question, so I'm going to try to check that. Oh, several. Okay. Okay, I'm not. Would changing U.S. immigration policies help our labor shortage? All right, not seeing these, I sort of stumbled into answering them. One of the guests asked, you stated a slight increase with international migration in 2020. Seems like simple math to me. Well, we have natural population growth in Nebraska as well as international immigration. So Nebraska has one of the highest birth rates of any state in the country. That's been true for several decades. So we tend to have an outsized cohort of high school and college graduates, and I suppose you have some non-graduates as well, but people leaving education and joining the workforce. We have an outsized cohort of those compared to most states, year in and year out. So in addition to international immigration, we have a growing labor force due to that. Now, obviously, brain drain reverses that to some degree, but I think even after the brain drain we see in the state, we have a pretty decent cohort of people joining our labor force on an annual basis. So we're not totally dependent on international immigration, but it sure can help us. One last question. What is the state of Nebraska doing to support increased need in emerging industrial sectors? Well, I think the university, for example, here at UNL, and I know other universities and schools, high schools and community colleges are making efforts to increase the programming for computer sciences. We've had some big new initiatives here. The state of Nebraska is very engaged in worker training programs and working with employers to train industrial machinery mechanics and other types of skilled manufacturing workers. So steps are being made. I would just encourage, I guess, even greater efforts in these areas. I believe along the way, I did talk about U.S. immigration policy. One last question. Did not know Nebraska growing internally with birth rates. Okay, that was more of a comment. Yes, it's one of the great Nebraska is a very family-oriented place. Great place to be a kid, in my opinion. Great schools. I'm not bragging about the university. I was referring to K through 12 schools. So it's a very family-oriented place. We tend to have larger families, perhaps in part because of that, or maybe because we have larger families, we invest more in our public schools and things for kids to do. Whatever the reason is, that's a big plus for us, for our economy. I'd say, along with the Ogallala Aquifer and a few other things, our status as a state where it's a great place to have a family and a young family is one of the big things that drives our economy. Okay, well, not seeing any other questions, I want to thank everyone for participating in our webinar today. If I can close the question and answer window here. I will point out that we have a webinar coming out on March 4th, where we'll talk about the economic impact of the military bases on our state's economy. And then I'll also note that you can follow Bureau reports on an ongoing basis on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web. See our website there. And then also, if you'd like to receive our reports via email on a regular basis, just email us at bbr@unl.edu and we'll get you on our emailing list. So thank you again for your time, everyone. Have a great day and weekend.